If we take a look at the secondary literature, we can easily get the impression that in Hegel's philosophy, the notion of good plays a much less crucial and controversial role than concepts such as spirit, absolute, or truth. But this will be deeply misleading, and in my opinion, there are at least two reasons for such confusion. The first reason is that Hegel does not speak of good as extensively as he does with other apparently more structural concepts. For example, the notion of spirit indicates, along with those of logic and nature, one of the basic forms in which the idea, that is the central core of Hegel's system, so to speak, unfolds itself. A different but equally important role is played by the term absolute, which recurs throughout Hegel's philosophy, especially in attributive form, absolute idea, absolute spirit, but also absolute beginning, absolute mechanics, and so on. And even in different cases, the notion of truth, like the term absolute truth, is also thematized in a mostly historical and critical way. Absolute is in reference to Spinoza's philosophy, truth in reference to Kant's, but which nevertheless plays a key role in the systematic path, as one can easily understand from phrases such as the truth of being is essence, or the spirit is the truth of nature, and so on. The concept of good has no such relevance, since Hegel, in his late system, explicitly speaks of good on only two occasions, namely in the logic, in the pages on the idea of the good, and then on the absolute idea, which is understood as the realized good, and in the philosophy of right, in the section on morality, and then at the beginning of the section on ethical life, where the Sittlichkeit is defined as the living good. The good, therefore, does not seem to indicate macro structures, as is the case with spirit, nor does it seem to play a key role in the systematic process. Hegel never says that something is the good of something else, as he does with the term truth. Good seems to refer simply to objects among others, so to speak. And this means then that while notions such as spirit, absolute, or truth must be investigated whether one is dealing with the science of logic, the philosophy of nature, or the philosophy of spirit, or whether one is tackling epistemological or ontological questions, as well as political, aesthetic, or religious issues, the concept of good, instead, seems to be relevant only to those dealing with a very specific problem in Hegel's practical philosophy, for example, to those dealing with Hegel's ethics. The second reason that, in my opinion, can lead to confusion about the meaning of the concept of good in Hegel's philosophy is due to the significant similarity between its occurrences. In fact, in both the logic and the philosophy of right, Hegel seems to use the same argumentative structure. To put it in a very general way, he firstly criticizes the identification of the good with an abstract principle that subjectivity must realize, and secondly, he shows that the good must be conceived as something real and concrete. So this similarity has therefore had two main consequences. First, that Hegel's conception of the good has been regarded by many interpreters as uniform and univocal, and as something that, again, concerns a very specific problem to which there is an equally specific solution. And secondly, that the two accounts of the good in Hegel's system have been taken as perfectly overlapping, with the result that the account in the logic, which is less known, is frequently made to match that in the philosophy of right, which is much more famous and studied. In this talk, I will try to show that these arguments are actually the result of several misunderstandings. And more specifically, I have two main goals. First, I will try to show that the idea of the good in the logic cannot be overlapped with the good in the philosophy of right. And second, I will try to argue that the idea of the good in the logic, unlike the good in the philosophy of right, plays a structural role, meaning that its analysis is relevant not only to matters directly related to Hegel's practical philosophy, but also to the understanding of his overall conception of knowledge and reality. And in order to demonstrate these two claims, I will proceed as follows. I will first outline some theoretical distinctions about the term good that will be helpful for my interpretation. After that, I will briefly present the idea in the logic, and then I will trace Hegel's analysis of the idea of the good in more detail. And finally, I will try to clarify what I mean when I say that the idea of the good in the logic plays a structural role, and what consequences this has for our understanding of Hegel's philosophy in general. So, the concept of good undoubtedly plays a central role in both in our daily practices and in philosophy. But to provide a precise analysis of it, not to mention a comprehensive definition, is a very complicated challenge. And leaving aside the history of this notion, in my opinion, there are two main reasons for this difficulty, which we could call respectively the ubiquity and the variety of the good. The concept of good is ubiquitous in the sense that, as is the case with many other similar notions, such as being or truth, it is so pervasive in our everyday life that it has almost no defined profile and is thereby very hard to grasp. In addition to this ubiquity or indeterminacy, there is also a second challenge, partly related to the first one, and which can be summarized by stating that the good, like the being for Aristotle, is said in many ways. Depending on the context, in fact, the term good can have different functions and meanings. And following the classification of Georg Heinrich von Wright, who spoke of the varieties of goodness, we can refer, for example, to instrumental goodness, when good means the suitability of an artifact to fulfill certain functions, as for example in the phrase a good hammer. We can speak of technical goodness, when the term good means good at, that is, it indicates the fact that an activity is performed well. For example, she's a good chess player. But good can also have the meaning of beneficial, for example, in the phrase fresh air is good. Or we can talk about hedonic goodness, which refers to the pleasant feelings that an object can cause in a subject, as an expression of like a good perfume, a good weather, or even a good joke, and so on. Okay, I don't think that it is necessary to list all the alternatives identified by von Wright. Now, faced with such a variety of meanings, uses, and context, one can be easily and legitimately discouraged from attempting to analyze the concept of good. Following some suggestions from the metaethical debate, I would like to try to shed some light on this tangle of meanings by proposing a distinction between three possible usages of the term good, namely between substantive, predicative, and attributive usage. In substantive usage, good is taken as a noun, such as in the phrase freedom of speech is a fundamental good. In predicative usage, good is taken as a predicative adjective, such as in the phrase this book is good. In attributive usage, good is taken as an attributive adjective, such as in the phrase this is a good car. It is important to point out, however, that in a famous article in 1956, Peter Geach questioned whether good can really be used in a predicative way, since its meaning seems to depend always on the object of reference. The term green, for example, is fully intelligible regardless of the object it connotes. This is illustrated by the fact that the sentence, this apple is green, can be divided into two sentences. This is an apple, this is green, that also make sense separately. But this does not seem to be the case for good. If we divide the sentence, this apple is good, into this is an apple and this is good, the meaning of good becomes completely indeterminate and the sentence no longer makes sense. And this is why, according to Geach, the term good can only be used in the attributive way. For example, in the sentence, this is a good apple, the meaning of the adjective good is determined by the fact that it's attached to apple, and for example, it means tasty. In the sentence, this is a good car, the meaning of good changes completely. And for example, it means fast or, I don't know, like affordable. This clarification is important because, and this is the main thesis I will argue, I believe that Hegel understands the concept of good primarily, though not exclusively, in the attributive sense. More specifically, I think that while in the philosophy of right, he uses the notion of good mainly in a substantive way, in the logic instead, he understands good mostly as an attribute of reality. And this for reasons similar to those of Peter Geach, namely that without any reference to specific objects, speaking of good is an abstract and contentless operation. And it is precisely this difference that allows us to grasp what I've called the structural role of the idea of the good. To clarify this point, however, it is necessary to take a closer look at Hegel's text. So, First of all, it is important to analyze Hegel's account of the idea in the logic. In the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, the idea is defined, and I quote, as the absolute unity of the concept and objectivity. And this definition sums up some key points. The idea is the concept, Begriff, that is the rationality that pervades and organizes objectivity, thereby guaranteeing intelligibility to the world and animating the human practices of thought and action. For Hegel, therefore, the idea is both ontological and epistemological in scope. It is the structure that organizes both the reality and the knowledge of reality. Hegel divides the doctrine of the idea into three sections: the idea of life, or the immediate identity of concept and objectivity, the idea of cognition, or the separation of concept and objectivity, and the absolute idea, or the full unity or unification of concept and objectivity, that is the reinstatement of the identity through the separation. The idea of the good, which Hegel also calls the practical idea, is together with the idea of the true or theoretical idea an internal moment of the idea of cognition. Now, Hegel defines the idea of cognition as, and I quote, the relationship of reflection of concept and objectivity, and thus, and I quote again, as the distinguishing of the idea within itself, end of quotation. Cognition is thus the breaking of the unity of life and the subsequent turning of the idea towards itself. Hegel analyzes this dynamic by splitting it up into a double movement, and I quote, represented by the idea of the true on the one hand and the idea of the good on the other. Hegel also calls the idea of the true, and I quote, the theoretical activity of the idea or cognition as such, and defines it, and I quote again, as the drive of knowing toward truth. That is to say, it is the tension of the subjective concept to know the reality external to it. In the same way, the idea of the good, which Hegel also calls, and I quote, the practical activity of the idea or will, action, is described as, and I quote again, the drive of the good toward its own accomplishment. It is the tension of the subjective concept to realize itself and shape objective reality. So if we then stick to, on the one hand, the definition of the idea as the unity of the concept and objectivity, and on the other, to the definition of the idea of the good as the practical activity of the idea, we can thus interpret the chapter of the idea of the good in the logic as a philosophical analysis of the practical relationship of the concept to objectivity, or as we might also say, as a philosophical analysis of the relationship between practical rationality and reality. So now we can look in more detail at Hegel's analysis of the idea of the good in the logic. Okay, so since it is a moment of the idea of cognition, the idea of the good too is the internal separation between concept and objectivity, and at the same time, the attempt to overcome this separation. Hegel identifies two main ways in which the idea of the good strives for this overcoming, and these are self-determination and self-realization. And I will try to address briefly both of them, okay? So Hegel focuses, first of all, on self-determination. And this notion is introduced at the end of the chapter on the idea of the truth, where Hegel writes, and I quote, the theoretical idea achieves its purpose only to the extent that the concept becomes for the concept. The idea, insofar as the concept is now for itself, determined in and for itself, is the practical idea, end of quotation. So Hegel here emphasizes the transition from the account of the idea of the true to the account of the idea of the good. And in the idea of the true, the concept, that is the subjective side of the idea, is entirely oriented toward reality, that is the objective side, which it attempts to know as the source of truth. In the idea of the good, on the other hand, the concept turns to itself and views only itself and not external reality as the source of value and therefore as worthy of attention, so to speak. The idea of the good is thus first and foremost the active self-reference of the subjective concept, that is the work of rationality on itself. Hegel then also reiterates this characterization at the beginning of the chapter on the idea of the good in the science of logic, and I quote, in the idea of the good, inasmuch as the concept, which is its own subject matter, is determined in and for itself, the subject is determined as singular, end of quotation. This is an extremely dense and complex sentence. I want just stress especially Hegel's emphasis on two fundamental features of the concept in this context, namely reflexivity and activity. In this quote, Hegel writes that in the idea of the good, the concept is the subject. It is its own subject matter. It is therefore a reflexive structure. And it is determined in and for itself. The concept is practical rationality, and it is therefore work on itself, so to speak. It is a structure that exercises its rational activity on itself, giving itself its own rules and ends. However, Hegel's analysis shows also the limits of this account. The fact that the subjective concept is completely turned in on itself and views itself as the only source of value leads to its distancing from objective reality. Hegel describes this screwing of the concept onto itself as follows, and I quote, "The certainty of itself that the subject possesses in being determined in and for itself is a certainty of its actuality and of the non-actuality of the world," end of quotation. So the concept is thus trapped in a form of abstract subjectivism, so that even the world becomes something non-actual, that is a mere external constraint which has no value or rationality. It is for this reason that Hegel describes the self-determining concept in the idea of the good as an absolute postulate. And this means that the concept generates a good that, although rational, that does not affect reality. But to conceive of the good regardless of the condition of its realization, that is, of the possibility of determining something, an action, an intention, a state of affair, a person, as good, is to forego a crucial aspect of our evaluation practices. The rationality outlined in this way is thus a normative instance that has no connection to reality, and what results are principles and values that exercises no power over concrete subject or objects. Now, as mentioned above, Hegel also analyzes the idea of the good in terms of self-realization. And he describes this process as follows, and I quote, "The idea of the good is the impulse to realize itself, the purpose that on its own wants to give itself objectivity in the objective world and realize itself," end of quotation. So, understood in this way, the idea of the good is the attempt of the subjective concept to realize itself in the objective world. That is, as Hegel writes also in the Encyclopedia, the attempt to determine the world. The concept tries thereby to overcome the separation that structurally characterizes it, seeking to unify itself with external objectivity. However, insofar as it is the attempt of subjective rationality to project itself on objective reality, this unification remains an extrinsic process. The reason for this is, again, the assumption that the concept is the only side of the idea possessing value, and that the objective side, as a result, has no value at all. In these pages, Hegel, in fact, uses the notion of reality or actuality in exclusively negative terms, namely as what confronts the good and restricts it from the outside. As a consequence, if the concept is the rational, reality is non-rational. If the concept is the source of the good, reality is, and I quote, "the evil or the indifferent which has no value in itself." And in the light of this, Hegel then concludes, and I quote again, "The realized good is good by virtue of what it already is in the subjective purpose, in its idea. The realization gives it an external existence, but since this existence has only the status of an externality, which is in and for itself null, what is good in it has attained only an accidental, fragile existence, not a realization corresponding to the idea," end of quotation. So the central problem lies in the very notion of objective reality that is presupposed. This presupposition leads the process of self-realization to produce nothing but a fragmented good, Hegel says accidental and fragile, that is a good that no longer has anything of its original value. And in this way, the idea of the good, which at the beginning was conceived as the attempt to realize itself in the objective world, in the end proves to be the structural impossibility of realization. Now, the recognition that the idea of the good is doomed to contradiction by its very structure allows Hegel to take a final, fundamental step, namely the transition to the absolute idea. As a consequence, this transition has a twofold significance for the idea of the good. First, it is the overcoming of its limitation or one-sidedness, and thus the unification of subjective concept and objective reality. Second, this transition consists in the fulfillment of an essential feature of the practical idea, namely its impulse to realize itself. The absolute idea is therefore the good finally realized. In the account of the good that Hegel outlines in the final step, then, reality is no longer an external constraint without value, that is, an empty space that subjectivity must shape according to its own rational hands. As Hegel writes in The Science of Logic, reality is now, and I quote, the objective world whose inner ground and actual subsistence is rather the concept, end of quotation. In other words, the good is now the inner ground of the world. But what exactly does this mean? And in order to clarify this point, the conceptual distinctions I made at the beginning about the different usages of the term good become helpful. First, however, a clarification is needed. In referring to Hegel, I mean these distinctions not in a linguistic sense. Mine is not an analysis of Hegel's use of words, but in a philosophical sense. Put differently, I'm interested in understanding the theoretical function that the concept, not the word good, has within Hegel's philosophy. Now, to say that the good is the inner ground of the world, or that the world is the realized good, has two main meanings. In the first place, this means that reality is endowed with value, and as a consequence, can be conceived according to value criteria. That is, it can be understood as better or worse, desirable or repulsive, worthy or unworthy, and so on. And this means, as a result, that we can use good in an attributive meaning. It is only because of the analysis of the idea of the good and its realization that it is possible to speak in the context of Hegel's philosophy of a good action or a good state, but also of a good oak, a good horse, or a good poem. The good, as conceived in the logic, is a feature of reality and of everything within it to the extent that rationality is manifested in them to some degree. This allows me to explain what I called at the beginning of my talk the structural role of the idea of the good. Like notions such as absolute, spirit, or truth, the notion of good as outlined in the logic also has a function that does not end with its direct thematization, that is, with the chapter on the idea of the good in the logic, but as reverberations on Hegel's entire system. In this case, it is only by considering the good as an essential feature of the absolute idea that it is possible to make assessments about the goodness of a particular object, and thus to speak of a good book, a good philosopher, as well as a bad book or a bad philosopher. But there is also another meaning, perhaps even more general, which is related to the attributive usage of the concept of good in the context of Hegel's philosophy. This meaning has to do with the definition of the idea of the good as the practical activity of the idea, as action, as the impulse to realize itself. In this regard, I believe that the transition to the absolute idea allows Hegel to conceive of reality not only as value-laden, but also as active and processual. This has two main implications, one ontological, the other epistemological. The first is that in Hegel's account, both the natural and spiritual world are not something static and merely given, but as an essentially dynamic nature. This does not simply mean, of course, that reality is temporal, that is, that it changes over time. To say that the world is practical for Hegel means more specifically that reality is a process oriented toward the realization of reason. It is on the basis of this feature that we can therefore judge something as good or bad, better or worse. The more an entity realizes its rational potential, namely its concept, the more it can be valued. The second attributive meaning of the idea of the good as practical idea is that, as a consequence, Philosophy, for Hegel, does not have as object, at least not primarily, static things, but processes, or if you want, events, that can be properly described only if taken within the dynamics in which they happen, and that cannot be reduced to other entities, such as, I don't know, like state of affairs. The realization of the practical idea and the absolute idea, therefore, sets the possibility for Hegel to recognize processual and rational character to being as well as to knowledge. And this explanation should finally have also made clear the difference between the idea of the good in the logic and the good in the philosophy of right. In the elements of the philosophy of right, Hegel describes morality as the opposition between the authority of abstract norms and value and the reflexive activity of the moral subject. At the heart of this analysis, then, is the attempt to establish a relationship between these two extremes so that the normative space constitutes the foundation of subjective agency. The good under consideration here is thus an abstract moral principle that finite consciousness attempts to pursue. In the same way, Hegel defines the living good in the section on ethical life, and I quote, as the concept of freedom which has become the existing word and the nature of self-consciousness, end of quotation. Namely, it is the set of practices and institutions through which human beings organize the social and political reality in which they participate and in which they recognize themselves. As we have seen, things are different in the logic. The idea of the good does not address the problem of normativity from the perspective of the finite individual, nor is it concerned with particular instantiations of the good. As a speculative analysis, the chapter on the idea of the good in the logic does not even have a directly ethical or political scope, as is the case with the philosophy of right. It concerns, and we have seen this, the conditions for the realization of practical rationality, both in the sphere of spirit and in that of nature. This difference is captured once again by the different function of the concept of good in the two contexts. In the philosophy of right, Hegel uses this concept with a primarily substantive meaning, that is, to qualify certain object, principles, or states of affairs as goods. In this sense, the family is a good, education is a good, the state is a good, and there is also, of course, the good in the sense of the abstract principle of morality, or the living good in the sense of ethical life, Sittlichkeit. Also in the logic, of course, Hegel understands the good in a substantive way. After all, he speaks of the idea of the good, realization of the good, and so on. But as I've tried to show, the central task of the chapter on the idea of the good in the logic is to set the condition for the attributive usage of this concept. This attributive usage is instead absent from the philosophy of right, in which, on the other hand, it would not make much sense, since the good there designates either an abstract moral principle, which therefore does not determine anything good apart from itself, or in the case of the living good, a specific domain, namely social and political reality. And one could thus admit a limited attributive usage of the good with respect of the sphere of ethical life. However, there is no need for this, since the possibility of viewing the practices and institution of the Sittlichkeit as possessing value is already determined by the absolute idea as realized good. Now, I turn to the conclusion. The problem from which I started in my talk is the role of the good in Hegel's philosophy. And in order to give an answer to this problem, I focused on the pages of the logic, on the practical idea, and then on the transition to the absolute idea. The reason for this choice is, as I tried to show, that Hegel there does not analyze the good just as a moral instance or principle, but as an attribute of reality as rational, that is, as one of its essential features. In this regard, I believe that the idea of the good in the logic can be understood as Hegel's attempt to answer the fundamental question, paraphrasing the title of a very famous Raymond Carver short story, what we talk about when we talk about good. And this means what do we mean by the concept of good in our judgments and our practices? And on what basis, accordingly, can we say that something is a good, or, as is more often the case, that something is good or is a good sample of its kind, a good pen, a good book, a good friend. I believe that in the logic, Hegel provides us with a possible explanation for this phenomenon. The good is a constitutive component of the world we inhabit, both of nature and of spirit, meaning of human life forms. And it is only because of this that we can have value experiences and make value judgments. And these judgments can be more or less correct according to their ability to grasp properly the degree to which the good, and therefore rationality, is realized in the things we evaluate. What we talk about then when we talk about good? Not about a mere moral principle, nor about something that concerns exclusively the ethical or political domain, but about the fact that, to quote Hilary Putnam and thereby conclude, experience isn't neutral. It comes to us screaming with values. Thank you very much for your attention.